Don't call him Dad. He doesn't deserve it. My daughter's voice trembled through the church microphone as her husband smirked beside her. The congregation gasped. Chandeliers flickered above me, but no one moved. No one defended me. My hands shook on the pew. Before we dive into how it came to this, if you believe karma always finds its way, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Don't call him Dad. He doesn't deserve it. My daughter's voice trembled through the church microphone as her husband smirked beside her. The congregation gasped. Chandeliers flickered above me, shadows swaying across stained glass as if even heaven recoiled. I sat frozen in the pew, my hands trembling against the polished wood, my body trapped between fury and disbelief. But no one moved. No one defended me. Not a single voice rose up against her words. It was a Sunday service, our church filled with neighbors, co-workers, old friends who had watched Melissa grow up. I had taught her to ride a bike in this very parking lot, held her hand through her first communion here. And now, standing under the same vaulted ceiling, she erased me with one sentence. Ethan Brooks stood proudly at her side, his arm slipping around her waist as though he had won some final victory. His smirk wasn't careless, it was calculated. He had been waiting for this moment, savoring the humiliation like fine wine. My daughter's betrayal was his stage, and the entire congregation his audience. I searched the crowd, desperate for a sign, someone shaking their head, someone rising to say, "That's her father." But the silence was a knife. Friends I had fixed cars for, neighbors I had lent tools to, fellow worshippers I had prayed beside for decades, each one lowered their gaze, unwilling to meet mine. My wife wasn't there. Her health kept her home that morning, sparing her this cruelty. I almost envied her absence. To watch your only child disown you publicly, to feel your name stripped away in God's house, it was worse than death. The choir's last note still hung faintly in the air, as though time itself refused to move on. Melissa's words echoed louder than any hymn, louder than the pastor's sermons ever could. I did not cry. Tears would have given them victory. Instead, I gripped the pew so tightly the veins in my hands bulged. Beneath the shame, something colder began to form a silence, sharper than their cruelty. Ethan thought he had ended me in that church, but he had only opened a door he could never close again. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, yet no one dared to speak. And in that suffocating silence, I realized something. They had taken my title as Dad, but they had also freed me from mercy. I bowed my head as though in prayer. But inside, I was already planning, and when I lifted my eyes again, I wasn't the same man they thought they had broken. I wasn't weeping, begging, or defeated. I was silent, and silence is the most dangerous answer of all. I used to believe sacrifice was love. Every scar on my hands, every dollar I tucked away instead of spending, every night shift I worked at the garage, I told myself it was for Melissa. I had a dream once, a simple one, to open my own auto shop. My name on the sign, a place built from sweat and skill. But when Melissa needed braces, when she needed books for school, when she dreamed of college, that dream became dust beneath my boots. I traded it all for her future. I remember the smell of engine oil that clung to me when I came home past midnight, Melissa asleep on the couch waiting for me. She'd stir awake, smile groggily, and say, "Thanks, Dad." That single word erased the exhaustion. It made every sacrifice worth it. Or so I thought. When she graduated, I stood in the back of the auditorium, hands still blackened from the morning's work, clapping until my palms stung. She was radiant, her cap slipping as she hugged her friends. I thought to myself, she'll never know how much I gave. But that's okay. She doesn't need to. Love, I believed, wasn't meant to be tallied or displayed. It was meant to be silent, steady, unseen. When she needed a place to live after college, I cleared out the spare room, gave her privacy, and saved enough to help her move into her first apartment. When her car broke down, I didn't just repair it, I bought her one that wouldn't leave her stranded at night. And when Ethan came along, loud and ambitious, I ignored the unease in my gut. I told myself, if she loves him, then I'll learn to love him too. The years of grease, sweat, and broken bones never felt wasted, not until I saw her hand slip into his in church as she erased me. That was the moment I understood the truth. All the sacrifices I made were not forgotten. They were rewritten. In Ethan's voice, I was not a father but a fool. And Melissa believed him. The bitterness rose in me like smoke, thick and suffocating. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel it not as weakness, but as clarity. The years I gave away were not gone. They were waiting to be accounted for. And soon, they would be. Ethan Brooks did not arrive in our lives like a storm. No, he came quietly, charming, the kind of man who knew exactly how to wear a smile and shake a hand. He praised me often, called me Dad, with a warmth that felt real, and acted as though he admired my work ethic. I told myself Melissa had chosen well. He seemed respectful, attentive, ambitious. But ambition, I would learn, has two faces, one for the world and one that lurks in the shadows. At first, he asked questions about my trade, how engines worked, how a business could be run with honesty and grit. I thought perhaps he looked to me as a mentor. I even taught him small repairs, showing him how to change a belt, fix a carburetor. He nodded eagerly, always quick to compliment. I mistook his curiosity for respect. In truth, it was reconnaissance. Slowly, his tone began to shift. At family dinners, he made small jokes at my expense. Old-fashioned. He'd call me, or he'd laugh at my reluctance to use credit cards. Melissa giggled at first, brushing it off as playful teasing. I let it slide. Fathers must have thick skin, I told myself. But every comment chipped away at her image of me, carving doubt where pride once stood. He whispered, too. Melissa would repeat his words without realizing their source. Dad, maybe you should stop working on cars. It's too much for you. Or, Dad, maybe you shouldn't handle money anymore. You forget things. Words planted like seeds, watered by repetition, until Melissa no longer saw me as strong, but as fragile. The man who once praised me began to speak as if I were a burden, and Melissa, my daughter, who once clung to my hand, began to believe him. I saw it in her eyes, the hesitation, the pity. She still smiled at me, but there was distance in it, a quiet judgment I could not touch. Ethan had woven himself into her trust, and in doing so, he began unraveling mine. What started as admiration became corrosion. What I thought was family became poison. And on that Sunday, when she clutched his hand and silenced me forever, I finally saw the truth. Ethan had been building this stage for years, and Melissa, blinded by his ambition, became the instrument of my betrayal. For most of my life, the community saw me as steady, reliable, the man who could be counted on when an engine failed, when a tire blew, when a neighbor's car wouldn't start in the dead of winter. They trusted me, not just with their vehicles, but with their respect. People said I had hands that could fix anything, and a heart that would never say no. For years, that was enough. When Melissa was young, she basked in that same reputation. Neighbors praised her for having a father who worked so hard, who never turned his back on anyone. She grew up on the respect my labor earned. And in those years, the church was our second home. I watched her sing in the choir, sit proudly in the front row during Sunday school, and later stand on the very stage where she would one day erase me. But as Melissa drifted into Ethan's orbit, things shifted. He carried himself with wealth, or at least the appearance of it, flashy suits, expensive shoes, the kind of confidence that made people listen. Slowly, the congregation began to admire him. At gatherings, conversations that once began with me shifted toward Ethan's ventures, his plans, his promises. I noticed the difference in how people looked at me. The mechanic's grease that once symbolized honest work became a stain in their eyes. My silence, once seen as dignity, turned into invisibility. The same men who once asked for my advice now leaned closer to Ethan, eager to be part of his orbit. Even Melissa began to follow that shift. Phone calls grew shorter, visits rarer, holidays became excuses, and birthdays passed with quick messages instead of time spent together. Ethan had wealth to flaunt and dreams to sell. I had nothing but sacrifice to my name, and sacrifice doesn't glitter. The Sunday they erased me was not a single moment. It was the culmination of years of erosion, trust corroded by whispers and ambition. When she spoke those words into the microphone, she wasn't just rejecting me. She was echoing the voice of a community that had already chosen who to follow. I sat there, surrounded by people who once swore I mattered, and realized I had become a ghost in my own life. Not hated, not even despised, simply forgotten. And sometimes, forgetting can cut deeper than hate itself. I did not cry that Sunday. Tears would have given them the ending they wanted, proof that their betrayal had broken me beyond repair. Instead, I sat still, hands pressed against the pew, breath slow and heavy. The sting in my chest was real, but beneath it, a colder truth began to take shape. Betrayal no longer felt like a wound. It felt like evidence that everything I had given was now dismissed, everything I had sacrificed erased, and yet that very dismissal lit a fire they did not see coming. Ethan's smirk told me he believed the curtain had closed. He thought this was my last appearance, the final humiliation that would push me into silence and keep me there. Melissa believed it too. I could see it in her eyes, the certainty that I was finished, that the man she once called Dad had been stripped of the title forever. But neither of them remembered what I still held quietly, away from sight. In the bottom drawer of my desk at home lay years of papers Ethan had once begged me to hold for him. "Just temporary," he had said, sliding the envelopes toward me, voice dripping with false trust. "Safer in your name, Dad. You know I can count on you." And I, blind in my devotion to Melissa, had agreed. Every signature, every stamped page, every reckless scheme Ethan needed shielded from consequence, he had handed them all to me. He thought those documents were forgotten, buried under dust. But in that pew, as the silence pressed around me and my daughter's voice erased me before God and man, I remembered every sheet of paper. Ethan believed he had silenced me. What he had really done was give me the reason to speak through proof, through law, through the kind of justice that doesn't shout, it strikes. I bowed my head as though in prayer. But in my heart, I wasn't praying. I was counting, calculating, preparing. They had stripped me of the title Dad, but in doing so, they had freed me from mercy. And when mercy is gone, only justice remains. The man who rose from that pew was not the same man they tried to bury. He was quieter, yes, but quieter is not weaker. Quieter is sharper, colder, inevitable. And sooner than they would ever expect, the silence they mocked would become the weapon that destroyed them. The night after the church service, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my hands. These were the same hands that had built Melissa's childhood, the same hands that tightened the bolts on her first bicycle, that steadied her car when she nearly lost control on a rainy road, that repaired every broken thing she brought home. They were scarred, cracked, permanently marked by years of labor, and still, she had called me undeserving. Memories bled together like oil stains on concrete. I saw myself at 25, crawling under cars to earn enough for diapers and formula. At 30, I was working back-to-back shifts so Melissa could have new shoes for school instead of hand-me-downs. At 40, I was patching together college tuition, juggling side jobs, just to make sure she graduated without debt. Every line on my face was carved by sacrifice. Every ache in my bones was proof of love. I remembered nights when the garage was empty, the air still heavy with gasoline, and I stayed late fixing cars I'd undercharged for, because the families couldn't afford more. Melissa would fall asleep waiting for me on the couch, books spread across her lap. Sometimes I carried her to bed, kissing her forehead, promising myself she'd never know the weight I carried. Love, I believed, was silent. It didn't ask for thanks. But now I understood silence differently. My silence had been taken for weakness, my sacrifices mistaken for obligations. In Ethan's voice, I was not a provider but a fool. In Melissa's voice, I was not a father but a burden. The betrayal stung, yes, but beneath the sting was a deeper ache. The realization that I had given decades of my life to someone who could erase me in a single breath. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the house too quiet without the sound of her laughter, without the echoes of the little girl who once called me her hero. The clock ticked loud in the silence, and each second drove the same truth deeper into me. They thought I was finished. They thought their words had ended me. But the truth? The truth was that my sacrifices were not wasted. They were receipts, and one day soon I would make sure Ethan and Melissa saw the cost. There was a night I can never forget. Melissa called me with tears in her voice, panic spilling through the phone. She and Ethan were behind on rent, their electricity bill unpaid, eviction hanging like a noose over their heads. "Dad, please," she whispered. "We don't have anyone else." Her words cut me in half. Of course they had someone else, they had each other, but I was the one she turned to, because she knew I would answer. I remember opening my dresser drawer and pulling out the envelope I had been saving for years. Inside was my safety net, a few $1,000s I had scraped together slowly, dollar by dollar, meant for my wife's medications and, maybe one day, a quiet retirement. My fingers lingered on it. I could hear my wife's voice in the back of my mind, urging caution. But Melissa was my daughter. She needed me, and so, without hesitation, I drove through the night and pressed that envelope into her hands. Her eyes welled with gratitude, and she promised to pay me back. She hugged me so tightly that for a moment I believed it would be different, that maybe she still saw me as her father, still cherished what I gave. But weeks passed, then months. No repayment came, not even the mention of it. Instead, Melissa and Ethan laughed about new furniture they had bought, about weekend getaways, about investments Ethan was making. When I asked just once about the money, Melissa brushed it off with a wave of her hand. "Dad, don't be silly. You know we'll take care of you someday." And Ethan, sitting smug in his leather chair, smirked and added, "Yeah, Dad, you've got nothing to worry about." His tone wasn't reassuring. It was mocking. That was the night something inside me cracked. For years, I had given without expecting a return. But this time, I realized they weren't just taking my money. They were taking my dignity. What I had offered in love, they twisted into obligation. And obligations, once dismissed, turn into chains. I walked out of their apartment that evening with my pockets empty but my mind heavy with clarity. My daughter no longer saw me as her protector or provider. To her, I had become nothing more than an endless well, and wells, when drained dry, are left to crumble. When Melissa's wedding approached, I should have felt joy. Instead, I felt the weight of numbers pressing against my chest bills, loans, and balances that refused to stretch. Ethan wanted chandeliers, velvet drapes, and a reception hall fit for royalty. Melissa's eyes sparkled as she described it all, her voice filled with the same excitement she once used when talking about school dances or summer vacations. I wanted to give her that joy, even if it meant burying myself deeper into debt. So, I mortgaged the house. The home where Melissa had grown up, the walls painted with her childhood laughter, the floors scratched by her first attempts at roller skating. I signed it away so she could have her fairy tale. My wife sat quietly beside me at the bank, worry etched in every line of her face. But she didn't argue. She knew I wouldn't stop. She knew I couldn't. The wedding itself was dazzling. Chandeliers glittered above the tables, the air sweet with roses and champagne. Guests marveled at the extravagance, whispering about how Ethan and Melissa had pulled it off. I stood at the edge of the room in my worn suit, clapping as they danced, smiling, as though my heart wasn't breaking beneath the weight of the mortgage papers folded in my pocket. Not once did Melissa or Ethan mention what it had cost me. Not once did they pause to thank me. When the speeches came, Ethan raised his glass to his business partners, Melissa toasted to her friends, and my name was never spoken. I was a shadow in the back of my own daughter's triumph. That night, as I loaded empty champagne bottles into trash bags after the guests had gone, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. Sacrifice was no longer love, it had become expectation. My willingness to bleed for her future had turned me invisible, the laborer behind the curtain of her happiness. I drove home with tired eyes, staring at the blur of streetlights, and wondered how long a man could keep giving before there was nothing left. But deep inside, another thought gnawed at me. If they could forget me on the happiest night of her life, how easily could they erase me forever? It began with Ethan's charm. He had a way of making problems sound like opportunities, debts sound like investments. One evening, he came to me with papers in his hands, his voice urgent but smooth. "Dad," he said, he still called me that back then, "I just need you to sign these for a little while. Safer in your name, you know? Creditors won't come sniffing around if it's under you. I'll take them back as soon as things settle." I looked at Melissa, sitting beside him, her eyes pleading. She believed him. She always believed him. And because she believed, I signed. My hands shook slightly as the pen scratched across the page, but I told myself I was protecting her. If Ethan went down, Melissa would go with him. Better to take the risk myself. It didn't stop at one set of papers. Soon there were more loan agreements, property deeds, contracts with names I didn't recognize. Each time, Ethan came with that same practiced desperation, that same convincing smile, and each time, Melissa stood behind him, nodding, urging me to help. So I did. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I could handle it. The stack in my drawer grew thicker, the weight of it pressing against me like a hidden anchor. I didn't fully understand what I was holding, but I knew enough to sense danger. Ethan was building a house of cards, and my name was the table it stood on. Without me, it would all collapse. Still, I stayed silent. I told myself this was what fathers did, they protected, even when it meant shielding their children from the storm. But there was one truth I didn't recognize then, a truth that would only come to me years later, sitting in that church pew. Ethan hadn't trusted me. He had used me, and every page I signed wasn't just a favor, it was leverage. Leverage he never expected I would use against him. What Ethan forgot was that paper lasts longer than lies, and in time those papers would speak louder than any sermon. My wife always carried a quiet strength. Even as her body grew frail, her spirit never bent. She would sit at the kitchen table with me, her thin hands resting on mine, and remind me to be patient. "She's our daughter," she whispered. "She'll come back. You'll see. This distance is only temporary." Her faith was unwavering, even when mine began to crumble. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that the little girl who once sat on my shoulders at county fairs, who painted Father's Day cards with crayons, would eventually remember who had carried her through life. But every passing year proved otherwise. Melissa's calls grew fewer, her visits shorter. Holidays became awkward exchanges of gifts bought without thought, wrapped in glossy paper but empty of care. On Christmas Eve one year, she didn't even show up. She sent a text instead. "We'll be with Ethan's family tonight. You understand, right?" I stared at the phone screen for a long time, my thumb hovering above the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. My wife tried to mask her disappointment, setting 2 plates at the table instead of 3, but her eyes glistened with the ache of absence. It wasn't just the missed holidays. It was the way Melissa's laughter no longer reached me, the way she spoke of Ethan's successes as though they were her own, while my sacrifices were treated like forgotten debts. Each time I saw her, she seemed a little further away, as if Ethan had built a wall brick by brick between us, and she had chosen to stand on his side. "Be patient," my wife kept saying. But patience is not endless. It stretches, yes, but eventually it frays. And with every missed dinner, every unanswered call, every holiday spent in silence, I felt the fraying inside me. My daughter wasn't just distant, she was gone. The hardest part wasn't losing her to Ethan's voice. It was realizing she didn't want to come back. The Sunday humiliation was no accident. I see that clearly now. Ethan had orchestrated it with precision, like a conductor leading a cruel symphony. The way he seized the microphone, the timing of Melissa's trembling words, the smirk that played across his lips, it was all planned. He wanted me erased, not just in my daughter's heart, but in the eyes of the entire congregation. I replayed it over and over in my mind. Melissa's voice quivered. Yes, but not with love. It was fear, or perhaps desperation. Fear of disappointing Ethan. Desperation to prove her loyalty. She clutched his hand as if it were an anchor, as if without him she would sink. And so she cut the rope that tied her to me. The betrayal burned deepest, not because of her words, but because of the silence that followed. A silence Ethan had counted on. The congregation, people who had once sought my advice, who had once shared meals at my table, sat frozen. No one stood. No one defended me. They watched, complicit, as my daughter severed me from her life. I realized then that Ethan had been whispering into more ears than just Melissa's 9. The community that once respected me now saw me through his lens, outdated, worn out, unnecessary. To them, I was no longer Robert Hayes, the man who fixed their cars and lent them tools. I was just the old fool Ethan described. That stage wasn't built overnight. Ethan had been constructing it for years, brick by brick, lie by lie, until the day came when Melissa could play her part in the performance. And she did. She spoke her lines perfectly, the daughter disowning her father, while Ethan stood triumphant beside her. But what they forgot, what Ethan, in his arrogance, could never imagine, was that every performance ends, curtains close, lights dim, and when the audience leaves, the truth is all that remains. As I sat there, humiliated, I told myself one thing. If they wanted to erase me, I would carve my name into stone. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would wait. And when the time came, their own words would bury them. That night, after the congregation turned its back on me, I sat at my kitchen table alone. The house was too quiet, the walls pressing in like witnesses who dared not speak. My wife had gone to bed early, her body too weak to carry the weight of the evening. I poured myself a glass of water, but it tasted like ash. My hands itched for something to hold, something solid in a world that had suddenly slipped away. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside lay the thick stack of documents Ethan had once begged me to safeguard. Contracts, property deeds, loan agreements, each one with my name etched across it. Back then, I saw them as burdens, as risks I had foolishly taken to protect Melissa from Ethan's failures. But now, staring at them under the dim lamp, I saw them for what they truly were: leverage. Each page was a confession Ethan had unknowingly signed. Each signature a rope tying him to me. Without my silence, his empire crumbled. Without my protection, his image of success turned to dust. For years, I had carried these papers like chains. But tonight, they looked more like keys. Melissa's words echoed in my ears. Don't call him Dad. He doesn't deserve it. If I was no longer her father, then I was no longer bound by the mercy of one. Ethan had stripped me of my title, but in doing so, he had also stripped me of restraint. The betrayal in church was not an ending, it was an awakening. They thought they had buried me under silence and shame. But I still had the one thing Ethan feared most: proof. Cold, legal, undeniable proof. As I closed the drawer, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My grief did not vanish, but it hardened into resolve. Ethan believed he had destroyed me. Melissa believed she had erased me. But the truth was far simpler. They had freed me. And soon enough, they would learn what it meant to leave a man with nothing left to lose but the truth in his hands. I cleared the kitchen table and laid the papers out like a map of a ruined city. Deeds, loan agreements, promissory notes, contracts with names that sounded like fog holding companies, management groups, ventures that existed only to hide other ventures. My name sat on each page like a thumbprint I had never meant to leave. I sorted them into quiet stacks. Properties first, one lake cabin I had never seen, a downtown office suite I had never set foot in, a storage unit whose key Ethan kept on his ring like a trophy, all titled in my name as temporary custodian. Temporary. That word echoed like a taunt. Next came the loans. Short terms, high interest, signatures written in Ethan's hurried hand beside my steady one. He had made me the shield. If creditors came calling, they would find me an old mechanic with a paid-off truck and a modest house, the perfect wall to crash into while he slipped out the back door. Then the contracts. Consulting agreements with blank scopes, services to be rendered as needed. Money flowing in circles out of one pocket into another, then back to me on paper but never in reality. I traced arrows with a pencil until the page looked like a constellation of lies. What struck me wasn't just what Ethan had hidden. It was how much he had trusted my silence. He believed I would never read, never ask, never learn. He thought love meant blindness. He thought fatherhood meant obedience. I turned to the last folder emails I had printed because I never trusted screens. His messages to me were syrup sweet. His messages to others, CC'd by accident, were bone cold. We can use the old man for cover. Keep the titles in his name until we settle the suits. He won't fight. I ran a finger along those words until the paper rasped under my skin. I did not tremble. I did not curse. I simply breathed, and in that breath I became someone new. Not a victim, not a martyr, a custodian of proof. I opened a notebook and wrote 3 lines. Revoke every authorization. Freeze access where the law allows. Deliver copies to counsel. I underlined counsel. Not vengeance, counsel. I would not play his game in the dark. I would turn on the lights. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the past arranged itself into order. These papers were no longer chains. They were keys, and I was done keeping doors closed for a man who had sworn to lock me out of my own life. Tomorrow, I would make the first call. Tonight, I would keep reading and remember everything they thought I had forgotten. The next morning, I carried the stack of papers to a man I hadn't spoken to in years, Daniel Carter, a retired lawyer who once lived 2 streets over. He had handled the closing papers on my house decades ago, back when Melissa still colored on the kitchen floor, and Ethan was nothing more than a name I had never heard. Daniel greeted me with the slow nod of someone who had seen too many broken families, and when I laid the papers on his dining room table, his eyes sharpened like a hawk's. He read in silence, page after page, his lips tightening as he moved from deeds to loan agreements to unfinished contracts. Every so often he tapped the page with his finger, muttering under his breath. When he finished, he set the last paper down and looked at me, not with pity, but with something colder. "Robert," he said, "do you realize what you're holding here?" I shook my head slowly. "I only know it's mine." That's all he left me. Daniel leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Number. This isn't what he left you. This is what he gave away without thinking. You're not just holding leverage, you're holding his lifeline. Without these, Ethan Brooks is finished. Legally, financially, maybe even criminally." The words sank into me like lead. For years, I had believed my silence was strength, but now silence looked more like complicity. Ethan's empire wasn't built on ambition, it was built on me. My name was the scaffolding that kept him upright, and all I had to do was step away for the whole thing to collapse. Daniel tapped the stack again. "You could destroy him tomorrow if you wanted. The law is on your side." I didn't answer right away. My mind went back to the church, to Melissa's trembling voice declaring I didn't deserve to be called Dad. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she had convinced herself I was nothing but a burden. But Ethan knew better. Ethan knew that every piece of paper he hid under my name was another chain tied to his throat. And now, for the first time, I felt the weight shift. I was no longer the man being erased. I was the man holding the pen that could rewrite everything. Daniel didn't waste time with sympathy. He leaned forward over the piles of deeds, loans, and contracts, his glasses slipping down his nose as his pen traced dates and signatures. "Robert," he said, his tone flat, "this isn't just leverage. This is a noose, and Ethan tied it himself." I watched him circle names of shell companies, highlight interest rates that bled greed, and mark contracts that had no clear purpose. He pointed out the patterns I had missed, repeat addresses that led to empty mailboxes, notary stamps appearing on weekends, signatures rushed and sloppy. Every line was another fracture in Ethan's foundation. The more Daniel spoke, the quieter I became. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. For years I had believed my silence was an act of protection. But looking at those papers under Daniel's steady hand, I realized my silence had been Ethan's camouflage. He hid behind me, behind my name, behind the assumption that I would never question him. Daniel tapped the final page with the back of his pen. "If this lands in court, Ethan's done. He'll drown in explanations before he even gets to trial." His words weren't dramatic, they were clinical, surgical. The law wasn't on Ethan's side. It was standing beside me, waiting for my signal. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, labeling each one: deeds, loans, contracts, correspondence. For the first time, they weren't weights pressing down on me. They were proof, undeniable and sharp. Ethan thought he had silenced me, but every signature he left behind was a confession. I looked Daniel in the eye and nodded once. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth to stand taller than his lies. And I had everything I needed sitting right in front of me. Truth was no longer hidden, it was sitting in front of me, waiting to be used. Daniel's advice echoed in my head. Paper doesn't lie. Collect it, date it, preserve it. So I did. I began the quiet work of turning scattered scraps into a case no one could ignore. I visited the county clerk and pulled certified deeds, watching each page stamped with the weight of the law. Ethan's prized cabin? Mine. His office suite? Mine. Even a storage unit he bragged about in passing was listed under my name. For years, he flaunted wealth built on property he didn't legally own. And now, with every official seal, his illusion cracked wider. At the courthouse, I searched filings and saw Ethan's name appear in disputes, creditors chasing him, vendors accusing him of hiding assets. One line stopped me cold. Held under a relative's name, I didn't need to guess who that relative was. The law had already written me into Ethan's crimes. When I called the storage facility, the manager confirmed the unit was under my name. An appointment was set. I didn't need to force a lock, I would be opening my own door. Inside, neat stacks of boxes and plastic bins carried Ethan's handwriting, bridge accounts, consulting, cover. I photographed everything before I touched it. Discipline, Daniel said, is what separates proof from suspicion. Among the piles, I found contracts copied from the same template, invoices with repeating numbers, even a notebook with columns labeled R, M, and cover. Next to R, my initials. Next to cover, arrows pointing toward the word titles. The meaning was clear. Ethan hadn't just used me. He had built his entire facade on me. I sealed the evidence, labeled it, and set it aside for Daniel. No shouting, no grand gestures, just quiet preparation. The kind that would hold up under any scrutiny. That evening, I sat with the papers spread across the dining table. Patterns emerged, loops of money leading nowhere, notary stamps that didn't match business hours, signatures that smelled of forgery. Piece by piece, the illusion of Ethan's power unraveled. And as I stacked everything into boxes, one thought carried me. They believed they had erased me. But in truth, every page, every signature, every forged line had carved me deeper into their story. And when the time came, it wouldn't be my words that spoke. It would be the paper they left behind. By the time I finished sorting the evidence, I realized I was no longer looking at random scraps of paper. I was staring at a confession Ethan had written in ink, line by line, over the course of years. The arrogance of it was staggering. He thought my silence would last forever, that I would never learn to read between the lines he left behind. But I had learned. And now I had everything. I gathered the recordings next. Old voicemails I had saved without knowing why. Ethan's voice, thick with desperation. Dad, I just need you to cover this one. I'll pay you back next month. Another, Dad, don't let me drown here. You're the only one I can count on. At the time, I had answered those calls with pity, with the instinct of a father trying to protect his child's world. Now, hearing them again, they were no longer cries for help, they were evidence of dependency. Proof that Ethan's empire only stood because I carried the weight. Alongside the voicemails, I had the church video. Melissa's voice breaking through the microphone, her words slicing through the congregation. Don't call him Dad. He doesn't deserve it. Daniel told me to hold on to that clip. Public rejection shows intent, he said. It paints a picture. Courts don't forget pictures. I began to imagine how it would look side by side. Ethan's groveling calls for help against Melissa's public denial of me. The same man who mocked me in the sanctuary had begged me in the dark. The same daughter who told the world I wasn't her father had leaned on me for every roof she lived under, every car she drove, every bill she ignored. For years, I had believed their betrayal was personal. But now I saw it differently. Their cruelty had written a narrative even stronger than I could have crafted myself. They had built the rope. All I had to do was hand it to the law. I pressed play on one last voicemail. Ethan's voice, hoarse and frantic. You know, I can't survive without you, Dad. Just one more favor. The words that once chained me now unlocked something else resolve. I wasn't their safety net anymore. I was the ledger. And the ledger was finally ready to balance. I learned patience in the garage. Engines don't reveal their secrets to hurried hands. You listen, you watch. You let the machine tell its story one rattle at a time. That patience became my armor now. Ethan wanted spectacle rage, shouting, a confrontation that would make me look like the bitter old fool he had painted. But I gave him nothing. My silence became strategy. Each night, I sat at the dining table with my wife asleep down the hall and arranged the evidence into tighter order. Deeds, contracts, loan papers, each with a tab. Each cross-reference to a voicemail, a receipt, or a date. I built a wall of paper, one brick at a time, until no lie could squeeze through the cracks. Daniel kept reminding me, do not rush. The law rewards discipline, not anger. So I did not rush. I moved carefully, documenting chain of custody, photographing every page, labeling every envelope. What once looked like clutter now looked like a case. A case not of revenge, but of truth sharpened into a blade. And as I worked, something inside me shifted. The grief that had once kept me awake at night began to burn away, replaced by a colder fire. I no longer replayed Melissa's words in church with sorrow. I replayed them with clarity. Her voice had erased me before the congregation, but her voice would now serve as proof of intent, proof of betrayal. Proof that when the time came, no one could call this personal vengeance. It was justice. By the third week, I felt a strange calm I hadn't known in years. My hands, once trembling in that church pew, were steady again. My back, bent from decades of labor, straightened as if bracing for something inevitable. I wasn't the broken man they thought they had silenced. I was the man keeping count. And when the count was finished, Ethan would discover that silence is not weakness. Silence is preparation. And preparation is the sharpest weapon of all. By the time the last folder closed, I was no longer the man who had walked out of the church in silence. That man carried grief like a weight. This man carried proof like a weapon. Every document, every voicemail, every certified seal, they were no longer burdens. They were blades, sharpened and waiting. I stood in the center of my living room, the stacks of evidence boxed and labeled around me. 3 full sets existed now, one with Daniel, one locked in a fireproof case at home, and one hidden where only my wife knew. Redundancy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Ethan had counted on my forgetfulness, my trust, my willingness to look away. But I wasn't looking away anymore. I was staring straight through him. I realized something as I taped the last box shut. Melissa and Ethan hadn't just betrayed me. They had underestimated me. They saw an aging mechanic, a man bent by years of grease and sacrifice, someone easy to dismiss. But they forgot what those years had given me: endurance, steadiness, the ability to outlast. The silence that followed Melissa's words in the church had once felt like a grave. Now it felt like the stillness before a storm. They thought the story ended that Sunday, with me erased and forgotten. But the real story was just beginning, and it was one they would never control again. When I looked in the mirror that night, I didn't see a father begging for forgiveness or a man broken by betrayal. I saw something colder, steadier, a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore everything to reveal. The evidence was ready. The law would do the rest. And Ethan Brooks, who once smirked as my daughter disowned me, would soon learn the cost of underestimating silence. I turned off the light, leaving the boxes stacked by the door. Tomorrow, the storm would move, and this time, it would move with my name on every page. The morning I acted, the air felt different, lighter, almost expectant. I didn't shout. I didn't warn. I simply gathered the folders Daniel had prepared, each one thick with proof, and placed them into my worn leather briefcase. For years, Ethan had believed silence meant surrender. Today, silence meant execution. The first step was revocation. Daniel had drafted letters for every registry, every insurer, every bank. In plain words, they stripped Ethan of any supposed authority connected to my name. No more temporary custodian. No more forged signatures passed as favors. From that morning on, nothing could move without my explicit approval. Each page carried my signature, dated and notarized, simple, heavy, undeniable. At the post office, I sent the packets by certified mail. Green receipts slid back across the counter, official and irreversible. Those slips were more powerful than any confrontation, because once delivered, the clock started ticking. Ethan could bluff against rumors, but he couldn't bluff against the law. Next came the properties. The cabin he bragged about each summer, the office suite he used to impress investors, even the storage unit hiding his secrets, they all sat under my name. That day, I filed notices of control and requested lock changes where legal. It wasn't theft. It wasn't sabotage. It was possession. And possession, under law, is 9/10 of truth. At the bank, the manager reviewed my documents in silence before finally speaking. From this moment forward, no account moves without your direct approval, Mr. Hayes. For the first time in years, my name belonged only to me. By nightfall, the foundation Ethan had built on borrowed trust began to crumble. Not with noise, not with drama, but with quiet procedures, each one stamped, sealed, and dated. I didn't need to raise my voice. The law was speaking for me now. They stripped me of the title of father in front of a church. But today, I reclaimed every other title that truly mattered. And unlike their words, my documents would not fade. The second step was exposure, not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. Daniel called it controlled disclosure. We didn't blast accusations. We delivered documents. Paper travels farther than anger, and once it lands, it cannot be ignored. I began with the church. A packet was sent to the pastor and the board, each page tabbed and dated. Deeds, contracts, certified copies, even a transcript of Melissa's words from that Sunday. No explanations, no demands, just records. When gossip met evidence, gossip died. Next came Ethan's circle. A select handful of his investors received the same information, property titles, notices of revocation, proof that his empire stood on my name, not his. I didn't accuse him of fraud. I didn't need to. The papers spoke for themselves, stripping him of credibility in the one place he valued it most, among men who measured worth in signatures and seals. By afternoon, the ripples began. A deacon texted me quietly, "Robert, I didn't know. Forgive my silence." An elder offered to sign as a witness for the documents. And one investor, sharp enough to see where this was headed, sent a notice of suspension halting distributions until ownership was clarified. His words were careful, but the meaning was clear. Ethan was finished. Ethan tried calling. I let it ring. His voicemail came through, brittle with panic. "You don't know what you're doing." I forwarded it to Daniel without comment. Panic always leaves fingerprints. By evening, 2 more packets had been filed, one with the county auditor requesting verification of signatures, another with the storage facility confirming the sealed inventory and chain of custody. Both simple, both irreversible. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I sat at my table, writing the day's notes into my ledger. Exposure wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, about showing the truth without needing to shout. And truth, once shown, cannot be unseen. It didn't take long for the ripples to reach Ethan. One by one, the doors he once strode through began to close, not with noise, but with the quiet certainty of paper doing its work. Investors were the first to act. A notice came through suspending distributions, pending clarification of title. Another requested a meeting, this time addressed not to Ethan, but to me. The wording was polite, but the meaning was clear. They no longer trusted him. They trusted the documents. The bank followed. A compliance officer called to confirm that fraud alerts had frozen several accounts under my name. "No further movement without your direct approval, Mr. Hayes," she said. Her tone carried no curiosity, no sympathy, just procedure. And procedure is a wall Ethan couldn't climb. Insurance was next. Policies that Ethan had leaned on for years were updated overnight, naming me as the sole insured. Claims he had filed in my absence were quietly denied. In one line of corporate language, the foundation of his security cracked. Even the church responded. A brief statement appeared in the bulletin the next Sunday. "The matter concerning Robert Hayes has been resolved in full. We regret any harm caused by previous remarks." It was short, bloodless, but powerful. Whispers in the pews shifted, and the same congregation that once sat in silence now avoided Ethan's gaze. He called me again and again, first angry, then pleading. I didn't answer. Daniel handled each attempt with the same reply. All communication must go through counsel. Silence, once my burden, had become my boundary. By the end of that week, Ethan's circle shrank. Contractors complained of unpaid bills. A business partner sent me screenshots of Ethan's empty promises. Allies who once praised him began to distance themselves. Without momentum, without access, without credibility, Ethan was left standing alone. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply wrote it down in my ledger, each notice, each call, each quiet betrayal of the man who once thought he held all the power. They humiliated me in front of a church. Now, without raising my voice, I was watching his world unravel piece by piece. And this was only the beginning. Melissa never called. She sent a text, instead 3 short words. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone face down. Need was a word she had worn thin. For years, every plea, every emergency, every favor had been framed as need. But when I had needed her in that church, she gave me silence. Daniel advised against responding. "Let the record stand," he said. Still, my hands trembled as I thought of the little girl who once painted cards for me on Father's Day. That little girl was gone. The woman who stood beside Ethan that Sunday had erased her. Instead of answering, I acted. Daniel and I prepared one final packet, this time addressed to both families. Inside were certified copies of the deeds, loan records, and contracts, along with a thumb drive containing the video of Melissa's public rejection. No commentary, no accusation, just proof. Proof of what Ethan built, and proof of what Melissa chose. We sent it to her in-laws, her cousins, her mother's siblings. A quiet unveiling. Gossip is fragile when truth arrives in an envelope. By the next evening, messages trickled in, not to Melissa, not to Ethan, but to me. Words like, "I'm sorry, I didn't know, and we should have spoken up." Their apologies couldn't erase the hurt, but they confirmed what mattered. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. At the same time, Daniel filed formal motions to revoke every authorization Ethan had ever pretended to hold. He submitted copies of my notarized revocations to the court, along with evidence of Ethan's misuse of my name. The law doesn't move fast, but once set in motion, it doesn't stop. Ethan's foundation trembled. I did not confront Melissa. I didn't send angry replies or demand explanations. I let the paper speak. She had chosen her role the day she raised that microphone. Now the world could see it for themselves. As I sealed the last envelope, I felt the weight shift again. This wasn't about reclaiming her. It wasn't even about punishing Ethan. It was about record against rumor, law against arrogance, silence against spectacle. They had stripped me of a name in church. But now, with every seal, every certified page, I was giving them something permanent in return. Their own words, captured and preserved, never to be undone. The fallout came quietly at first, like the sound of glass cracking before it shatters. Invitations that once arrived weekly in Ethan and Melissa's mailbox stopped showing up. Their names slipped off guest lists. The same people who once clapped at Ethan's speeches in the fellowship hall now crossed the street to avoid him. No confrontation, just distance. That's how reputations die by inches, not explosions. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers. A woman who once praised Melissa's devotion leaned close to her friend and muttered, "Can you believe what they did to him, after everything?" Another nodded, her eyes narrowing. Gossip that once humiliated me now turned against them. Neighbors grew polite but cold. Where Ethan once boasted about his deals at block parties, he now found no one willing to listen. Contractors refused his calls. Even relatives from his side of the family, men and women who had cheered Melissa's rejection of me, sent cautious messages to my wife, offering condolences disguised as concern. The church, too, shifted. At Sunday service, I walked in alone and sat near the back. Heads turned, but not in pity. People nodded. Some stood to shake my hand. A deacon whispered, "We were wrong to stay silent." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence they once used as a weapon now belonged to me. And Melissa, she tried to smile through it, but I saw the cracks. She avoided eye contact when we passed in the pews. Ethan sat rigid beside her, his jaw tight, his confidence bleeding away in the quiet judgment of those around him. They thought wealth and bravado would shield them, but the weight of evidence, once revealed, has no mercy. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I simply kept walking, steady, unhurried, knowing every step I took was one further from their lies. They had wanted to erase me. Instead, they had erased themselves. And the cruelest part of justice? It doesn't scream. It whispers, it isolates. It leaves you standing alone in the ruins you built yourself. Ethan's downfall wasn't announced with headlines. It unfolded in paperwork, in meetings he wasn't invited to, in opportunities that slipped from his grasp before he even knew they were gone. The man who once strutted into rooms with a smirk now found doors closed, investors hesitant, and partners unwilling to return his calls. Daniel kept me informed, not with flourish, but with facts. One company had filed for dissolution after discovering Ethan had no legitimate authority to sign under my name. Another halted distributions entirely, citing material misrepresentation of ownership. Even the bank, once a quiet accomplice to his confidence, froze his access and demanded audits. Melissa tried to hold on to appearances. She smiled at gatherings, though fewer invitations arrived each week. Her friends grew cautious, her cousins distant. I watched her mask slip in the grocery aisle when she thought no one was looking. Her hand trembled on the cart handle. Ethan barked something sharp, and she flinched. The cracks in their facade were widening. I didn't need to confront them. The truth was doing it for me. Every certified copy, every notarized revocation, every recorded voicemail, they worked together like gears in a machine. Slow, steady, unstoppable. At night, I sat with my wife and read her the updates. She listened in silence, sometimes nodding, sometimes closing her eyes, as if to finally rest. "It's not revenge," she whispered once. "It's restoration." I didn't answer, but I felt the weight of her words settle inside me. Restoration. Yes, that was the word. Ethan had thought he ended me in that church. But as the walls of his empire buckled, it was clear who had been erased. Not me, him. And soon there would be nothing left of his illusion but paper trails leading straight to the truth. The final crack came when Daniel handed me a letter from the state attorney's office. Short, official, precise. "We are reviewing the documentation provided regarding Mr. Ethan Brooks. Further correspondence will follow." That was all. No drama, no threats. Just the weight of law shifting its gaze. Ethan must have felt it. He showed up at my driveway one evening, headlights cutting across the yard. He didn't step out of the car at first. He just sat there, engine idling, shoulders hunched. When he finally emerged, he looked smaller, his suit wrinkled, his voice hoarse. "Robert, we can fix this," he said. "We're family. Don't drag this any further." I said nothing. Daniel had warned me. Silence is safer than anger. I let Ethan talk. He tried bargaining, pleading, even threatening. Each word rolled off him like oil, slick and desperate. But his words meant nothing against the stack of evidence already sitting in offices with seals and case numbers. When he realized I wouldn't answer, he snapped. "You think you've won? You're destroying your own daughter." His voice cracked in the night air, echoing against the quiet street. For a moment, I saw the arrogance again, the smirk that had poisoned Melissa's heart against me. But this time, it was hollow, a man swinging at shadows. I turned my back and walked inside. No raised voice, no last word. The door shut with a sound more final than any argument. Ethan's car idled for a few minutes longer before pulling away. Inside, I sat at the table, staring at the neat boxes of evidence lined along the wall. They didn't just hold his downfall, they held my freedom. And that night, I understood something. The fight was never mine to win with fists or fury. It was mine to finish with patience, with proof, with law. And the law was already moving. Ethan just hadn't realized it yet. The showdown didn't happen in a boardroom or a courtroom. It happened back in the same sanctuary where they had humiliated me. Sunday morning, same chandeliers, same pews. But this time, the silence didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. Daniel had advised me carefully. Bring nothing but the record. Let the words they spoke undo them. So I walked in with a single envelope, slim compared to the boxes at home, but heavy enough to change the room. Melissa and Ethan were already seated near the front, heads high but shoulders tense. The congregation watched them with curiosity, unease the kind that spreads when truth has already traveled faster than rumor. When the service ended, I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped forward, placed the envelope on the pastor's table, and looked at my daughter. "This is the truth," I said. My voice was steady, almost quiet, but it carried. The pastor opened the envelope, pulling out copies of deeds, contracts, and a transcript of Melissa's words from weeks earlier. Gasps rose as the papers moved from hand to hand. Ethan tried to stand, his voice breaking. "This is taken out of context. He doesn't understand." But the room no longer listened. The very people who once averted their eyes from my humiliation now stared at him with suspicion, with anger, with shame. Melissa's hand clutched his arm, but even she looked pale, shaken by the weight of what could no longer be denied. I didn't gloat. I didn't accuse. I simply turned to the congregation and said, "They tried to take my name. Instead, they gave me theirs." And then I walked out, leaving the papers behind, leaving the silence to do what it always does, settle, spread, convict. Outside, the air felt sharp, almost clean. For the first time since that terrible Sunday, I breathed without weight on my chest. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't begged. I hadn't sought revenge. I had let the truth stand on its own feet. And the truth, once revealed, doesn't need me to hold it up. It stands taller than any lie. The morning after everything, the house finally felt like mine again. No phone buzzing with demands. No letters waiting to be signed under someone else's name. Just silence, the kind that rests, not the kind that suffocates. I brewed coffee, watched the steam curl upward, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of someone else's survival pressing on my chest. My wife sat across from me, frail but smiling. She studied me the way someone studies a wound that has finally closed. "So it's done?" she asked softly. "It's done," I answered. Not with triumph, with peace. I walked through the room slowly, touching the walls, the frames, the photos that once stabbed me with memory. Melissa as a child, paint on her hands from a school project. A birthday cake with lopsided candles. A crooked grin in a graduation gown. They no longer hurt. They were history, not chains. I could see them now without breaking. Outside, the garden had been overtaken by weeds. I pulled them up one by one, pressing new seedlings into the soil with calloused hands that had once built her world. Hands that once carried burdens too heavy for one man alone. Now they carried only earth and water. It was enough. Neighbors waved cautiously as they passed. Some stopped to offer awkward words, half apology, half small talk. I nodded, not out of forgiveness, but out of release. I didn't need their validation anymore. Respect is quiet when it returns, but it always returns. Inside, I fixed the small things I had ignored for years. A squeaky hinge, a leaking faucet, a step that tilted when you put your weight on it. Each repair was small, but each one was mine. They were reminders that my life didn't belong to Ethan or Melissa anymore. It belonged to me. That evening, I sat on the porch with my wife, listening to the sound of crickets rising like a chorus in the dark. The word forgiveness drifted into my mind, but I let it pass. Forgiveness is for those who seek it. They never did, and I don't need it. What I need, I already have. Stillness, freedom, and the quiet knowledge that I will never again be erased. They tried to take a title from me. Father, they will never touch what I hold now. Freedom is not loud. Freedom is not a gift. Freedom is a decision, and I've made mine. In the weeks that followed, the noise of Ethan's unraveling never reached my doorstep directly. It came in fragments, whispers at the store, murmurs in the pews, a cautious nod from a neighbor who once praised his ambition. Each fragment carried the same message. The world had shifted, and not in his favor. I heard that investors had pulled out, that creditors had started knocking, that the same men who once shook his hand with pride now refused to take his calls. One contractor stopped by my gate, shaking his head as he explained how Ethan owed him months of wages. "I should have seen it sooner," he muttered. I didn't respond. The lesson wasn't mine to give, it was his to carry. Melissa kept her distance. There were no more texts, no more sudden visits, only silence. But this silence was different from the one in church. Back then, silence had cut me down, left me alone in humiliation. Now, her silence felt like space I could finally breathe in, space where her choices no longer dictated the weight I carried. One Sunday, I returned to the sanctuary. I didn't sit in the back this time. I chose a seat in the middle, where the chandeliers cast their light evenly, where every gaze could see me and every whisper had to pass through me. The pastor paused when he saw me. A deacon reached out his hand. People shifted uncomfortably not because of me, but because of the shadow Ethan had left behind. When the choir sang, I didn't hear Melissa's voice anymore. That absence should have broken me. But it didn't. I realized then that I no longer needed her song to feel whole. My life wasn't measured by what she gave me or what she took away. It was measured by what I chose to keep, and what I kept was mine again. My name, my peace, my quiet place, under the same roof I nearly lost to their greed. For the first time in a long while, I walked out of that church, not as the man erased, but as the man restored. Life settled into a rhythm I had nearly forgotten. Days that once felt like battles now felt like breaths. Ordinary, steady, mine. I woke with the sun, not with worry. I worked in the garden, not in court. And in the evenings, I sat with my wife, listening to the kind of silence that heals instead of wounds. Yet even in peace, reminders found their way to me. Letters arrived addressed to Ethan but tied to properties still in my name. Each one I forwarded through Daniel, each one another nail in the coffin he had built for himself. I didn't need to read them in detail. The law had already taken over, and the law doesn't forget. Sometimes I would see Melissa in town. She avoided my eyes, hurrying past with her head down. Once, at the market, she stood in line 2 people ahead of me, shoulders stiff, hands trembling as she reached for her wallet. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. I didn't either. There was nothing left to say. The bond had been severed not by me, but by her own choice, and choices carry weight long after words are spoken. Neighbors spoke less of Ethan now. His name was mentioned only in whispers, the way people speak of storms that tore through once but are gone now, leaving ruins behind. They looked at me differently, not with pity, not with shame, but with quiet respect. The same respect I had lived by all my life. The respect Ethan had tried to strip from me. One evening, I found myself in the garage again. The smell of oil, the scattered tools, the half-fixed mower, waiting for my hands. It felt like stepping into an old skin. I tightened bolts, wiped grease, and for the first time in years, I worked not out of obligation, but out of simple joy. My hands had been used to carry burdens that weren't mine. Now, they returned to what they were meant for, fixing, creating, building, and as I stood there, wiping sweat from my brow, I realized the truth. They had taken nothing from me that I wasn't willing to give. What remains now is stronger than what I lost. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, like dust on a well-worn workbench, like evening light spilling through a garage window. And it was mine again. The legal process ground forward, steady as a tide. Daniel sent me updates, filings accepted, responses demanded, hearings scheduled. Each envelope bore seals and case numbers, cold symbols of a system that had finally turned its eyes on Ethan. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply placed the papers in a drawer, marked the dates in my ledger, and carried on with my day. I found strength in the ordinary. Fixing a loose board on the porch, sharpening the mower blades, reading aloud to my wife in the evenings when her hands were too tired to hold the book. These were things no one could strip from me, not with whispers, not with microphones, not with signatures forged in haste. Ordinary life became my rebellion, my quiet refusal to be defined by their betrayal. From time to time, people asked if I would reconcile with Melissa. "She's still your daughter," they said, as if blood alone could erase what had been spoken in front of God and congregation. I gave no speeches. I simply shook my head. Love cannot survive without respect, and respect had been buried that Sunday morning. I would not dig in the dirt for what was already rotting. The truth was simple. I did not hate her. Hatred would have chained me as tightly as their betrayal had. No, I felt nothing. And nothing is stronger than rage. Nothing is freedom. One afternoon, I sat on the porch as rain swept across the street, washing the dust from the pavement. The world smelled clean again, sharp and alive. I thought of Ethan, of his empire collapsing into filings and debts, of Melissa clinging to a man who had built their life on lies. I felt no triumph, Only distance. They were storms I had stepped out of. For years, I had believed survival meant silence. Now I knew survival meant choosing where to place your voice. I had chosen, and in that choice, I found not vengeance, but peace. The world around me kept moving, but I no longer lived in its shadow. I walked through town without shame, clinging to my back. People greeted me again, cautious at first, then warmer as time passed. They didn't bring up Ethan's name. They didn't need to. His silence was its own confession, louder than anything I could have said. At the diner, the waitress who had once avoided my table poured my coffee without hesitation. "Good to see you, Robert," she said simply. No pity, no apology, just recognition. That was enough. I noticed how peace comes in layers. First, the weight lifts from your shoulders. Then, your breath steadies. Finally, your mind clears, and you can see the world without the fog of betrayal clouding every thought. I began to enjoy small things again, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the sound of my wife humming while folding laundry, the cool air drifting through open windows at night. These weren't luxuries. They were anchors. Melissa remained silent. No calls, no letters, no footsteps at my door. I thought I would ache from her absence, but instead I felt only stillness. She had made her choice. I had made mine. And for once, our paths no longer collided. Ethan's name came up less and less. His empire crumbled quietly, piece by piece, until it became nothing more than rumor and warning. Parents whispered to their children not to trust men who build castles on borrowed ground. Contractors used his story as a cautionary tale over beers. In every version, I was no longer the fool. I was the proof that lies eventually collapse under their own weight. One evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, painting the sky in strokes of gold and fire. My wife joined me, resting her hand on mine. "You look lighter," she said. And she was right. The burden was gone. I didn't need reconciliation. I didn't need revenge. What I needed was already mine. A name untarnished, a home at peace, and the quiet dignity of a man who had survived everything meant to erase him. Peace is not something you chase. It arrives when you stop running. By the time autumn settled in, I realized I no longer woke with the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. I rose because I wanted to, not because fear dragged me forward. The town carried on as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the subtle shift. My neighbors looked me in the eye again. Men at the hardware store nodded with quiet respect. Even the pastor, once silent in my humiliation, stopped me after service and said, "Robert, we owe you more than words." I only nodded. I wasn't looking for words. I had found something better, distance. Melissa's silence stretched on. No calls, no apologies, only absence. But absence, I learned, doesn't always wound. Sometimes it heals. I filled the empty spaces she left with work mending fences, painting shutters, repairing what time had worn. My home grew stronger even as the ties to my daughter dissolved into dust. Ethan's shadow faded completely. His name, once spoken with admiration, became a warning whispered between neighbors. Don't trust a man who hides behind another's name. That was his legacy. And I didn't need to add to it. The law had already carved his story into record, and records last longer than rumors. One evening, I sat with my wife on the porch, the air crisp and cool. She leaned against me, her breathing slow, her body tired but peaceful. "You carried us through," she whispered. I didn't answer. I just held her hand, steady and strong, the same way I had held on through every storm. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to look back. The past had written itself, and I had survived it. What lay ahead was mine alone. Peace isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of stillness. And I had finally found it. The final chapter of this story wasn't written in court or in church. It was written in the quiet of my own home, where no one could touch me anymore. The boxes of evidence were gone, filed, sealed, stored where they belonged. The weight they carried no longer rested on my shoulders. I sat at the same kitchen table where I once spread Ethan's papers like a battlefield. Only now it was clear, clean. A ledger sat open, not filled with debts or betrayals, but with simple notes: garden planted, roof repaired, wife resting well. Ordinary things, the kind that anchor a man more firmly than any empire ever could. Melissa's voice no longer haunted me. Ethan's smirk no longer lingered in my mind. They were echoes, fading into silence. I owed them nothing, not forgiveness, not attention, not even hatred. The law would finish what I had begun, and the rest no longer belonged to me. One evening, I stood on the porch and looked out at the horizon. The sun slipped low, painting the world in fire and gold. I thought of the words Melissa had once spoken into the microphone. "Don't call him Dad. He doesn't deserve it." And for the first time, I felt nothing. Her judgment had no power anymore. The title she tried to take had already been replaced by something far greater: freedom. It isn't forgiveness. It isn't revenge. It is the absence of need the moment you no longer look to others for worth, for validation, for peace. I had found it at last. As the crickets sang and the night air cooled, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I wasn't the man erased in church that day. I wasn't the victim they thought they had silenced. I was the man who endured, the man who stood, the man who walked away without chains. And I never looked back.